The question of whether Adolf Hitler was a pedophile has surfaced periodically in popular culture, polemical writing, and online debate, often driven by a broader desire to understand the psychological roots of extreme evil. It is an emotionally charged claim, because pedophilia is among the most morally repugnant of crimes, and Hitler already stands as one of history's most destructive figures. Addressing this question responsibly requires separating documented evidence from rumor, psychological speculation, and retrospective moral condemnation. When examined carefully, the historical record does not support the conclusion that Hitler was a pedophile, and the persistence of the allegation says more about how societies process monstrosity than about Hitler's actual sexual behavior. Hitler's private life has been scrutinized more intensely than that of almost any other historical figure. Biographers, intelligence agencies, journalists, and psychohistorians have pored over letters, diaries, medical reports, testimony from associates, and post-war interrogations. This level of scrutiny is important to keep in mind, because if credible evidence of systematic sexual abuse of children existed, it would almost certainly have surfaced in this extensive archive. Instead, what emerges is a picture of a man with deeply dysfunctional relationships, a distorted view of women, and a pronounced tendency toward control and emotional distance, but not one marked by sexual interest in prepubescent children. The origins of the pedophilia claim are murky and often trace back to conflations and exaggerations. Hitler's relationships with young women are sometimes cited, particularly his long-term involvement with Eva Braun, whom he met when she was 17. By contemporary standards, such an age gap raises ethical concerns, and even by the norms of the early 1930s, it was not entirely unremarkable, but not illegal or culturally shocking in Germany. Crucially, however, 17 is not prepubescent, and relationships with adolescents, however problematic, do not constitute pedophilia, as the term is clinically or legally defined. To label such relationships as pedophilic is to stretch the concept beyond recognition, substituting moral outrage for analytical precision. Other claims rest on anecdotal testimony from Hitler's political enemies or from sensationalist post-war accounts. Some writers have speculated that Hitler's alleged sexual repression, rumored impotence, or unconventional sexual preferences might have included an attraction to children. These arguments typically rely on a chain of inference rather than evidence. Hitler was psychologically abnormal, therefore he must have harbored every imaginable perversion, therefore pedophilia is plausible. This kind of reasoning is not historical analysis, but retroactive character assassination, and it risks turning complex human behavior into a caricature that ultimately obscures more than it reveals. It is also important to distinguish between sexual pathology and moral depravity. Hitler was responsible for the mass murder of millions, including countless children, through state policy, war, and genocide. The fact that he ordered or condoned the killing of children does not imply sexual interest in them. Violence against children in a political or ideological context, horrific as it is, arises from different psychological mechanisms than sexual attraction to minors. Conflating the two may feel emotionally satisfying, but it collapses distinct forms of evil into a single undifferentiated category, which weakens rather than strengthens moral understanding. Some psychohistorical approaches have attempted to diagnose Hitler retrospectively, suggesting everything from severe personality disorders to sexual deviance rooted in childhood trauma. These approaches can be illuminating when used cautiously, but they become speculative when they move beyond documented behavior. No credible medical professional who has examined the available evidence has concluded that Hitler met the criteria for pedophilia. His known sexual behavior, limited as it was, appears to have been directed toward adult or late adolescent women, often in relationships marked by domination, secrecy, and emotional detachment, rather than by a fixation on childhood. The testimony of those who knew Hitler personally further undermines the pedophilia claim. Members of his inner circle, household staff, and companions were interviewed extensively after the war, often under hostile conditions and with strong incentives to expose any additional depravity. While their accounts reveal a man who was controlling, manipulative, and often cruel, they do not describe sexual interest in children. In fact, many accounts emphasize his discomfort with overt sexuality and his preference for maintaining an image of asceticism, particularly in public. This does not make him virtuous, but it does not align with patterns typically associated with pedophilic behavior. Another factor in the persistence of the allegation is the symbolic role Hitler plays in modern moral discourse. He functions less as a historical person and more as a shorthand for absolute evil. In this symbolic mode, adding additional crimes or pathologies to his persona can feel redundant but emotionally reinforcing. If Hitler was not only a genocidal dictator but also a pedophile, then he embodies every possible form of wickedness, leaving no moral ambiguity. The problem with this approach is that it prioritizes emotional satisfaction over truth, and in doing so, it risks undermining the credibility of historical scholarship more broadly. There is also a political dimension to such accusations. In contemporary debates, labeling an enemy as another Hitler is a common rhetorical move, and accusations of sexual deviance, particularly involving children, are among the most potent tools for delegitimization. When historical figures are inaccurately portrayed as pedophiles without evidence, it sets a precedent that can be misused in the present, blurring the line between justified moral condemnation and defamatory fantasy. None of this is to suggest that Hitler deserves any benefit of the doubt in a moral sense. His actions speak for themselves, and they represent a level of cruelty and destruction that defies comprehension, but moral clarity does not require factual distortion. In fact, understanding Hitler as he actually was, rather than as a composite of every imaginable vice, may be more unsettling. He was not a mythic monster operating outside human norms, but a human being whose ideology, ambitions, resentments, and opportunism combined with historical circumstances to produce catastrophic results. Adding unsupported allegations of pedophilia can paradoxically make it easier to dismiss him as an aberration rather than confronting the uncomfortable reality that such evil can emerge from recognizably human traits. In the end, the question of whether Adolf Hitler was a pedophile can be answered with a high degree of confidence. There is no credible historical evidence that he was. The claim rests on misunderstandings of terminology, exaggerations of age differences, speculative psychology, and the understandable but misguided impulse to pile every conceivable atrocity onto an already infamous figure. Rejecting this claim does not rehabilitate Hitler in any way, nor does it minimize his crimes. Instead, it affirms a commitment to truth, even when dealing with individuals who evoke the strongest possible moral revulsion. That commitment is essential if history is to serve not as a repository of comforting myths, but as a rigorous, if often disturbing, guide to understanding the past.